think that keynote has really sort of teed us up for the next panel session on the UK approach, telecoms policy, innovation and future networks. And I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator for that panel, Dean Bubley, founder of Disruptive Analysis. Dean, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you, Matthew, and hello. I'm Dean Bubley. I'm an industry analyst and consultant. Some of you may have come across me on social media as Disruptive Dean because I sometimes take a contrarian view on things. But today I'm here to moderate a panel with three illustrious speakers, and we're going to be looking at what's going on with UK telecoms policy today and what we should be doing more of, how we should be focusing, what we do well, and how we fit that into the broader economic and social imperatives. So I'm looking at the principles for building out fiber and 5G and other future networks. Maybe we'll touch on security, resilience, innovation, both in large and smaller companies, and also perhaps an angle around inclusion and also the impact on climate change and sustainability and the role for networks, both in helping other solutions, but also the internal consumption of energy within our infrastructure. And there's certainly a whole set of possible policy levers there. My own priorities, I spend a lot of time talking about wireless networks. So I'm interested, I suppose one of the things I'm not a fan of is overhype. And I think that we need to have a balance between evangelism to get people interested in technologies and connectivity, but at the same time we need to be aware of overpromising or suggesting things will happen faster than they actually will. I'm also a big fan of talking about advanced connectivity in general, rather than singling out 5G or fiber or satellite or Wi-Fi. I went to an event in London last week on smart buildings. All of the sort of technologies used for, heating, air conditioning, ventilation, security, access control, all of that sort of stuff we're really going to need in the future of our infrastructure. And I was expecting a lot of discussion about 5G and Wi-Fi. And in fact, I found that the most interesting solutions were based on wiring, because a lot of the things you'll need in smart buildings, like door locks or lighting, need power. So you need to put a cable to things anyway, and they use that for communications too. And that was a bit of a sort of a wake-up call for me to not look too narrowly at one specific technology or even family of technologies, but to look at connectivity and what we can do with technology more broadly, and to sort of go in rather than say we've got a really, really impressive hammer, now where are the nails? We need to have a whole toolbox. So that's what I would like to see in terms of policies, is that sort of framing. There's also a lot of issues around barrier busting and the practicalities of deployment, whether it's sites for radio networks, whether it's digging up the road for fiber. And I think last point, and we'll maybe touch on this as we go through, is how the UK can sit into the global long-term development trajectory for connectivity. Whilst we're probably not going to have our own standards, and quite rightly so, we are in a position to start thinking about what design goals we want for 6G, for example, from 2030 onwards. And, for example, baking in environmental capabilities from day one. So as well as least cost routing or lowest latency, maybe we'll have lowest CO2 connectivity methods as a parameter in a network of the future. So I'll leave it at that. And at this point, I'll hand over to our three panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. I'm not a fan of reading out biogs. So I'll start off with Bjorn Odenhammer from Ericsson, who's the head of networks and managed services in the UK. Bjorn, over to you.
Thank you. And there you did read out my name. And so my name is Bjorn. Good to be here. No, but if I look and if I start by looking back and reflect a little bit on the last 12 months, it's obviously for myself been interesting because I relocated from Sweden to the UK in the midst of COVID and in the aftermath of Brexit. So that has its own challenges, but it also made me realize that I really made the right career choice, because I'm immensely proud of the work we have done together with sort of all the operators to keep the networks up and running during the pandemic, and making sure that we could all be connected. So I think that's something we should all sort of be quite proud of. It's also been a crash course in digitalization, because again, having moved, I mean, we were sitting negotiating with Howard and the BT team on a RAN contract that was all done through Teams. We never even met because it all happened during COVID. I had to find somewhere to stay. I signed up and leased a house in the UK, all through digital and all through video conferencing, and it all worked out. So I think we've learned a lot also in terms of how we can use digital tools, and that is really key. Then, if we look a bit then on the network as such and how can they evolve, I mean, having then I've lived in Sweden, I've lived in the US, and when I'm in Sweden, my family have a cabin up north. So I can sit in the car, drive 7 hours, be on phone calls or Teams conferences, and I will never drop a call. And that's a habit I've sort of developed. I was up meeting the BT team in Industrial Park in Ipswich a couple of weeks ago, driving home on M25. I was planning to have a Teams call, and I was dropping calls all the time, and I was pushed down to 3G quite a lot, and that's not really great with Teams. So it was really a bad experience, and I realized, okay, in the UK, I cannot do like this. I need to be at the place when I can trust the connectivity. So there's work to be done on the mobile system. So the call for evidence and the strategy that was announced by DCMS this morning is crucial, because if you look like, why are our towers in the UK only 25 meters, and will 5 meters more be enough to really get good coverage? Why is 100% of all site acquisition that 3 UK is trying to do in London appealed and slowed down so they cannot roll out networks? Why are those things, and how can we fix that? So I think there are basics, RF basics, that we need to fix across any operator. Then if we take some of the positives, I think 5G is really good in the UK. The collaboration between operators, industry, and government with some of the trials, and Catherine sort of touched upon a few of them. I think that's really good, and we're showcasing and innovating together and learning how we can apply 5G. Catherine touched upon ports. We built a port in Italy, in Livorno, and we could prove by just connecting the cranes and having some sort of smart metering, we reduced CO2 emission by 8.2% because they were basically more efficient in the way they were sort of using it. And that's a lot also from a financial perspective for that port, especially we all know now with the cost of energy and the lack of petrol. It's a good thing. So 8.2% is sizable, and this was one port. So I think those use cases and getting 5G applied across the board, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare, or whatever vertical we're looking at, that's really key. And just to sort of finalize, I think, as Ericsson, we are really trying to do our part. So we just released a brand new set of massive MIMO radios that will significantly cut energy consumption. It will cut, if I compare in Howard's network with the radios he's rolling out today, we can reduce additional 10% for 5G. But more importantly, so we cut the weight. So we'll take away like 200 tons of just sheet metal from our radios that are not then that's much more sustainable and less cost on the cell next towers, because they will be lighter and easier to deploy. So I think we are obviously part of that drive to really sort of try to build out 5G in a much more sustainable way.
Bjorn, thanks. And I'll come back to the port issue and some of the infrastructure and enterprise side of it in a few minutes. I'd like to introduce our other speakers first. Next up is Howard Watson from BT. Howard, I understand congratulations are in order for an award you won this week. So I hope the glow is still present in your introductory comments. Howard, over to you.
Thank you for that, Dean. And it also meant I got up at 5 a.m. this morning to get on a flight back from Amsterdam to be here with you today, albeit virtual. Back in the office. We're very keen at the moment on ensuring we're working back in the office. But again, if I just reflect briefly, as Bjorn's just done, I mean, clearly we've been through a period over the last 18 months where connectivity has absolutely proven and come to the fore in terms of its importance for the nation. And that's for people who have successfully worked from home, people who and children who have learned from home, and how we continue to be entertained from home. And, we've doubled the output of our connectivity factory during that period. Thankfully, mainly in the daytime, whereas the peak time, which is in the evening, was built for significant capacity. But, we also reflect on the fact that it's quite hard to find any industry that doubles its manufacturing output and revenues stay pretty flat. So that's one of the perennial challenges of our industry that we've got to work through and drive forward. But also, despite that, what is, I think a fantastic, what we're seeing right now is that we're actually all increasing our investment on infrastructure deployment. So if I look at BT, people will be aware of our sister company Openreach and the commitment they've made to build 25 million homes with fiber in the UK by December 2026. We have just over 5 million now. 1 million of those are connected to customers. And so we are, and I accept the fact on ultra fast and on full fiber, we're behind in terms of some of the European players. We focused on getting super fast to 95% of the population. I think the pandemic proved that was probably a good call, because I can't imagine doing what we'd done if we were all on copper broadband still during that period. But actually now we've leapfrogged ourselves to be, the country in Europe that's got the fastest build program at the moment. So significant progress that we're seeing. And Openreach, for example, built 555,000 FTTH homes in Q1 of this year. You'll hear what the Q2 numbers were early in November. And again, the other thing, and back to the levelling up agenda that we heard the minister talk about, in that 25 million home build programme, we've committed that 6.2 million of those will be in the rural, harder to reach homes, as opposed to the, just the urban and super urban parts of the UK. But of course, we are very much focused on converging 2, in fact 3 networks if you take public Wi-Fi into account as well. And so, the investment that we're also making in rapid rollout of 5G and extending coverage of 4G. We announced a few weeks ago that we want to get to 50% population coverage by 5G by 2023, and then actually to pretty much cover the entirety of the UK. I think by that we mean 90% landmass by 2028, but also with lots of innovative ways of customers being able to request coverage for, a scout group climbing up Mount Helvellyn in the Lake District, and we'll have solutions to provide coverage for that. And we're sort of innovating on those. So significant investment in driving those networks out there. And I think then through convergence, enabling the innovation in the industry. And again, it was great to hear the minister talk about how we're going to stimulate both the demand side in the UK. So, the organisations that are working with industry to look for ever innovative use cases of, ultra fast broadband and 5G, but also the supply side as well. How we can continue to drive smaller companies in the UK to contribute in this drive that we're making towards a more open, sort of disaggregated architecture for 5G and indeed in the future for our fixed networks. And so I think, that investment and doing that coming out of the back of a pandemic period is sort of great to see in our industry. I think we'll talk about innovation a bit later. One of the things, though, that we're very focused on is security. And, as these networks become ever more sophisticated and capable and taking on ever more critical activity for the nation and for the companies in the nation, then, and also as we're using more AI and machine learning capability, the ability to audit that and the ability to be assured of the security of those networks, I would call out as probably one of the most critical areas that we're focusing on right now. We currently block 5 million malicious online events every month in the BT network. That's increasing, that's doubling. So increasing at a rate of over 100% a year. That requires lots of clever innovation to stay ahead of those threat actors. I mentioned this because unashamedly we're launching our Eagle Eye platform today, so please read more about that. But that is, again, us demonstrating that we've got capabilities here to drive that security forward. So I'll pause there and back to you, Dean.
So thanks, Ad. Yeah, in fact, security is going to be one of the things we crop up later in the conversation as to whether that's a differentiator and perhaps sort of export opportunity as well, leadership opportunity for UK, where there's obviously a deep pool of security expertise. But I'd like now to go to our third speaker. And it's interesting, actually, because I've long been a fan of, as well as the diversity of supply of products into telecoms, what I would refer to as diversity of demand and new classes of service provider and new business models for owning and delivering networks. And Cellnex has got an interesting backstory there. And hopefully, Alfonso, you can touch on that during your intro and some of the comments we'll do afterwards. So, Alfonso Alvarez, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity as well. It's difficult to explain better than Howard and Bjorn what happened in the past 12 months. Speaking about equipment, of course, an MNO, one of our main customers. It's also, I think, important to mention that the networks were up and running. I think we can consider our sector as very lucky because other industries were completely affected in the revenues. And it was demonstrated, as Howard mentioned, that telecoms is now an essential service in all European countries and supporting economic growth, etc. Our contribution as passive infrastructure, depending on the country, passive, a little bit more active, that we have that DNA about trying to create value to our customers, maybe going beyond the infrastructure. But it's also important to mention, I think, that during the pandemic, the 5G deployment didn't stop. That means that our suppliers reinforcing towers, preparing the sites for then the equipment to come and to be commissioned didn't stop in their working, and that made it possible that the 5G rollout wasn't delayed. It's very interesting, I think, and thanks also, Dean, for let's say introducing the positioning of Cellnex nowadays. It's been also a very important period in terms of growth for us as a company, in terms of footprint in Europe. And we believe that the messages we share with our customers, mainly the mobile operators, of course, about value creation via shared investments, it's an important lever for the growth in general of their services. And it's not only about the towers or the rooftops or the small cells, it's also about things that we can do together, like, for example, solving coverage around the railways, which is a pending subject in most of European countries because of the difficult economics around the areas not so interesting for the operators to be covered. I think that there are opportunities about increasing broadband, where as Cellnex, we can support with our shared investment models to the MNOs and even potentially to the fixed operators, if we consider the fiberization, if we consider the data centers that will be needed in the future. I would like to raise this flag about how the passive infrastructure is something that in a shared way can be creating value for the operators and for the public authorities as well. And maybe also the evolution that we, as neutral hosts and companies similar to us, can bring into the market with this view. I mean, trying to shorten the time to market of new technologies, new solutions. 5G, in my view, will be a success if the so-called killer applications needing low latency really arrive to the market and to the real users. And probably this is most about industry, probably, where automation, robotics, etc., will really need this new performance from the networks. I suppose we will speak about enterprise a little bit later. As Cellnex, same message we always share with our customers. Our business is their business. So we are happy if Howard and all our CTOs, all the other MNOs, rely on our services, being those just passive, just access to the site, spaces, etc., or maybe a little bit more. We also provide services in terms of DAS coverage for Stadia, for underground, so our positioning in the market will depend on how brave, how ambitious MNOs are in terms of going forward with their deployments. And we will be there supporting them, hopefully.
Thank you. And that last point on the indoor connectivity and coverage, I think is a really important one, because that brings in a whole set of new policy challenges as well as technical ones, because there's some fundamental paradoxes when you start talking about public networks on private property and whose responsibility it is to deploy, to manage, to own, and to pay for. And I think that that's something that often gets overlooked in discussions about network coverage across the country and landmass. Actually, it's the indoor landmass where people live, not out. We talk about population coverage. Most of us live indoors. So I'm currently in a basement where obviously radio propagation is not ideal. Okay, I'd like to go back to one of the things that we heard at the beginning around enterprise. And clearly DCMS has had a pretty successful plan of pilots and test beds for 5G and other types of connectivity in manufacturing and other industries. There's a lot of interest in ports. I was at a port event last week as well. But we still aren't necessarily getting as fast uptake of advanced technologies. And it's not always obvious whether it's the robotics, which is the slow element, or the network. But in theory, we ought to be having more connectivity in more businesses. What should we be doing in terms of policy? I mean, obviously, we've got things like the shared access licenses if companies want to build their own cellular networks. We've got 6 gigahertz coming for Wi-Fi 6E. But what other policy actions would you like to see from government driving industrial uptake of advanced connectivity? Feel free to dive in. Howard, go for it.
I mean, I would say I think so if I look at the recent spectrum auctions and making more of the 3.x gigahertz spectrum available, starting to make some progress there in reducing fragmentation and making the 700 meg spectrum available. I think that's a critical step for us. It makes in the UK 5G standalone now practicable, and when we've got some work to do, and I'm working with my colleagues at Ericsson, on our core networks in enabling those to enable. We have to make sure that 5G standalone can deliver a better experience than pure non-standalone. So there's work to be done there. So I think it's about building momentum now. We just picking up the ports theme. We're doing work with Belfast Harbour there as well. So we are starting to see some of those industries really start to engage in this, and we're having lots of conversations. I mean, let's not forget that the pandemic has also affected investment by enterprises during that period. And so, we're now starting to see the bounce back, which is really encouraging.
I think that's quite reasonable, and I agree that for people who aren't familiar, standalone, if you like, is the first stage of what I'll call proper 5G rather than 4G++. And actually, within the later versions, and 5G comes in phases, like the next release 16 and 17 is probably where the cool stuff starts really happening. Bjorn, how do we accelerate that in enterprise? Firstly, get enterprises to understand that 5G is a journey, and secondly, how do we accelerate the important stuff?
Yeah. So a couple of questions in one question there. So I'll start by tying back to what Howard said also, and look, we talk a lot about technology, but when you go to the enterprise customers, they don't really care about whether it's standalone or non-standalone. They care about how they can run their port more effectively and what's the use cases they have, or at the manufacturing, how they can run it more effectively. So I think we need to build that momentum as an industry. We need to be much more out with the enterprise customer, understand their use cases and their needs. If I look at what we learned from head of research at Ericsson, he said sort of what was the learnings we have gained from 5G, and the main learning was don't wait. It wasn't like latency is great or anything like that. Don't wait. Go out and really work with the industry, because we may think that you need 5G, and there's tons of use cases you can solve with 4G. It's just that we haven't, as an industry, been there and focused really on those use cases. And I think that's a big shift in terms of basically behavior and culture, because it's the Howard's team in BT Enterprise and all of the other operators also need to go out and as Ericsson, we're trying to help in that and sort of making sure that we can share best practices from other markets and other countries and showcase that also for the UK market.
An interesting thing is you said that you think that enterprises shouldn't care about standalone versus non-standalone. Maybe they should care. Yeah, I mean, funny enough, I actually was at an event with someone from Ford who was trialing 5G and said one of their roles at the moment is feeding back to you or Ericsson what features to do first and prioritize in release 16. What do they want to see first? So I think actually perhaps if enterprises do understand this more, they're in a position to help drive rather than just be sort of take what you give them. Alfonso, well, you've got some interesting views on enterprise, I'm sure, as well.
Well, I'd say clearly, as I mentioned before, Industry 4.0 and its future should be a compelling business case for our deployments. I mean, commercial coverage, but of course, private networks. You mentioned at the beginning, Dean, that sometimes technology has also to cope with the capability of the target market to adopt new challenges or new evolutions. I think that from our experience, we are also commercializing private networks. We have some experiences in Finland and Sweden, and we are trying to start this area here in the UK as well. I think it's very important to accompany the potential customer in the definition of what are the real needs, because probably what private networks can bring into industry will depend a lot on how that industry is working, organized, processes, etc. The real value needs to be defined, aligned with the processes. I think security is also very important. They are maybe accepting that someone else, an operator, a neutral host, whoever, will be managing a network, and on that network, important and confidential information for that industry, etc., will be connected and transmitted. And this is very important for the enterprise group to accept that maybe in contrast with the initial approach by the big industry to this topic, we want our own networks, we want our own spectrum, etc. Approaching them with a proposal from the telecom sector needs to cope with this and to solve this, let's say, doubts or problems about security. I think it's very important. I'd say that probably after the pandemic, we are probably discovering in the UK that a new world is being created in terms of competitiveness, I mean, in terms of global industry and global economics. And I think that we will succeed if, as telecom sector, we bring differential value to the UK industry in terms of competition. I think that's the message we need to share. Always from a secure point of view, of course.
And actually, a question back to all of you, following on from this, is what strikes me is that there's a skills issue, an understanding issue, whether it's about 5G or anything else. I mean, this is perhaps one of the barriers. Is Yeah, and actually, it probably does favour Wi-Fi. There's probably 100 times more people in enterprises who understand how to build a okay Wi-Fi network and operate it than who understand how to, well, certainly deploy, but even run and operate and buy a 5G network. So, how do we get through that training network, that training challenge? I mean, obviously, from an operator's point of view, you'd love to just sell them a product, but they even need to be educated to know what they're buying.
But I can take, we use a lot of Wi-Fi in our factories, and when we went to the Ericsson head of supply, he's not just because he works at Ericsson, he doesn't know radio all that much. He's good at building stuff and producing stuff, and they knew what the problem was with Wi-Fi. So for them it wasn't a question of Wi-Fi or something else, because they could see that they wanted to connect more things, and they had disturbance between their different Wi-Fi network. Because in a supply plant, you don't just have one Wi-Fi network as we have in an office or as we have sort of at home. You have a Wi-Fi network per every equipment that you put in, because everyone puts it in, and they disturb each other. So I think they knew why they needed 5G, but I think you're onto something important, and that is, we need to educate the SI players who are out there, because they will always advise for Wi-Fi, because that's what they know. So it's easier. So there is an educational process that we need to work with all the smaller SI players, all the bigger SI players, to just. And it's not always Wi-Fi versus 5G, which is always fun to talk about, because there will be both. But you need to explain, when do you use the hammer, when do you use the saw, and what is again the best for you?
Or satellite, or 100 other things. But Howard, what's your view? I mean, this is a broader question about skills and network skills, connectivity skills. You clearly, as an operator, you've got a lot of talented people. But are you seeing your customers or potential customers? Do they have the knowledge that they need to work out what to buy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point we just made, we're seeing in our customers, gone are the days of where, let's pick a large customer, you'd have like, the IT people and the networks, the people who buy networks separate. I mean, and it's been like that for a long time. And as they've come together now, I do think there is a piece of work to be done here for us all to be better. Educating our sales and solutions teams, but also educating the end customers as to what we can do with, let's say, wireless networks generically, and what applications make more sense for Wi-Fi and what make more sense for 5G, or more generically, I would say, for unlicensed spectrum versus licensed spectrum, and because one's obviously tightly managed and one's essentially free for all.
I don't want to get too far down that, but it's more just understanding. By the way, I can see there's a couple of questions that are coming in from the audience, and I'll get around to those towards the end. But there's a couple of other topics I want to drill into first. We touched on earlier on security and cybersecurity. I want to broaden that out a little bit. Into sort of what are the, if you like, unique aspects of network technology we have in the UK in terms of skills, perhaps startups, established companies, that the UK is in a position to sort of take a leadership stance on internationally, perhaps whether it's in setting standards or best practices. My sense is that cybersecurity is possibly one of those, but I'm interested in your feedback on that specifically, and what else have you seen that's impressed you around the UK in particular? I don't know, Howard or Alfonso or Bjorn, jump in. And feel free to feel free to interrupt each other as well, or me.
Okay, I mean, being a telecoms guy, we are brilliant in this country at photonics. So in other words, how do you get light? How do you get electrical signals, convert them to light and put them down fiber? I mean, just look at what Southampton University have done in terms of pioneering hollow-core fiber. That's now a company to exploit that called Luminicity, and we're working with them, and looking at how you can do that. The other area we're good at is quantum, and in particular, quantum key distribution for a new type of encryption as quantum computing increases. But actually, to pick up your point, Dean, yes, I mean, I do think we have great cybersecurity skills here in the UK. big shortage of them. So I think we at BT take a large number of comp science graduates out of the UK universities and train them in cybersecurity. And I think that's something we've got to keep feeding that ecosystem. And then finally, we're quite good at software in this country as well. And it's a volume problem in many cases now, as opposed to a sort of, fundamental skills problem.
Thank you. Alfonso, I mean, Cellnex obviously operates in lots of different countries, so you might have a view of differences. Spectrum policy being one, but there's probably a bunch of other things you've seen as well.
It's very interesting, the different conditions from policy about spectrum to, realities about universities and startups. I really believe the UK made a very smart decision, the authorities, for example, with the allocation of spectrum being possible to enterprises. This is not happening in other countries. So you really need to engage with an MNO for private network deployment, which is another model with pros and cons. But if we want the big companies to explore this path, in particular for their important, processes with low latency, etc., I think that the capability for them to have direct access to the frequencies could be a factor making the difference for them to feel better about it, about the decision. In terms of, knowledge tissue fabric in the country, after several expatriations in different countries, I really believe the UK can lead in all Europe the transition towards the future. And if we try to look at the future and we consider, for example, software-defined networks, virtual RAN, things like that, it's true that, as Howard says, that having good people working on software is more and more difficult in these times. And there are very valuable profiles, and the industry is always trying to find the best ones. But the situation of the UK is clearly better compared to other countries to try and lead that transition. So I think we can be positive.
But just to add, I think on security, just the simple TSR rules that was set in the UK, I mean, they are quite well thought through, even though some of my guys in my team may think it's a lot of hard work to respond to them. But it forces us to think through how do we build equipment and really build for security from sort of start and design that into our software. So I think security is definitely an area that the UK as a country has a good position to drive and take a leadership role in and sort of get an industry thriving on security, because I think we can all realize that it's only in the beginning of security requirements. The more we go into cloud and the more we go into digitalization, security will just continue to be so important.
How do you see the sort of partnering and collaboration evolving? There's some things I see in the UK which are a bit different, whether it's the DCMS projects or things like the JOTS neutral host in building, which is a sort of, in my view, fairly unique way of actually getting all the four main mobile operators to be fairly collegiate about dealing with indoor coverage, which is going to be more important in the 5G era. Any other good examples of sort of partnering you're seeing, or what you'd like to see more of?
I mean, I would actually, my perspective is, I mean, if you look at the four MNOs in the UK, I think we're probably at a peak in terms of our partnering ability. If you look at what we achieved with the shared rural network, so this is getting 4G landmass coverage up to from up towards 90%. And I mean, during that first probably 9 months of the pandemic, myself, Scott Petty at the time, Patrick Binchy, Derek McManus, we were on continual, twice weekly calls, just ensuring that between us we were keeping things working. So I think the MNOs and partnering together, we launched a community alert system, which was tested recently. We did that within 5 months. You might argue it should have been there a long time earlier. But so I think that piece of it is working. 119, I could roll off loads of them. I think it's how we then reach out into that sort of broader ecosystem, though? Because we also partner well with our suppliers, whether that's Ericsson or Cellnex as partners. But do we reach enough into industry? That's where I think there's opportunity there, Dean.
In my view, Dean, being a neutral host, all our business is based on partnerships. We need to partner with landlords for having access to lands and rooftops for the sites. We need, of course, to partner with our customers, creating value, and with vendors, etc. There is something that I think is very important to consider, and that's how we solve connectivity problems in general that go beyond the commercially viable areas. And I mentioned, for example, the railways. Probably you know that we are partnering with Network Rail, and now hopefully in a positive way with the MNOs for the coverage of Brighton mainland, London, Brighton, as a first test of how, as a neutral host, we can support the MNOs and collaborate with Network Rail in solving the coverage in one of the most crowded lines. I think this is an example of how we can try to maximize the existing budgets. If we go to, for example, indoor, our view as Cellnex is we will be very happy always in proposing, dealing with landlords, real estate groups, shopping malls, stadia, whatever, and proposing interesting projects to the MNOs to fund and to come and cover. But we are perfectly aware that the MNOs' budgets are limited, and in the future, they will not be able to cover every single indoor need in a country. That doesn't make sense. So also engagement with the private sector, let's call it real estate, and the MNOs with models like yachts could make a big difference. And this is also something which is quite unique in the UK. It's not a collaboration among MNOs and neutral hosts that is happening in other countries. I think that's a good idea about how to try again to create value in areas where there's no clear competition or there's no direct interest. Last point I think would be small cells. Small cells is a concept that we all started to hear about 10 years ago, and I think it's now time with the 5G deployment to have a clear view about what the real needs about small cells will be, because in managing asset portfolios with the municipalities via concession or via open access mode or whatever, the cost for the MNOs in deploying small cells cannot be out of reason. The advantage for the network needs to be connected with the normal coverage. They need to densify somehow, but they need to do it at a reasonable cost. So it's another way of creating partnerships, owner of the asset, neutral host, etc., for densifying the coverage at a reasonable cost. I think we have examples ahead to maximize how we can partner.
And just to touch on the small cells, we're in discussion both with Cellnex and others and with all of the MNOs across the UK. The technology is there. The small cells are there. It's also a business transition in terms of going away from a legacy sort of DAS-centric build-out of indoor, because that was built for voice. Now we can build small cells who actually can provide 5G, and we have the technology, so you can put in one radio that will support all four operators. They can share that in a sort of JOTS type of deployment, and they can choose that they want to compete and provide a better indoor experience, and they can put in their own equipment. So there's both of those opportunities from a technology perspective. Then just tying back to the ecosystem, and sort of the enterprise part of it, as Ericsson, and this is more from a global perspective, but it's not just a smartphone that's a device. We are working with the likes of ABB and Comau, which makes robots for manufacturing, and looking into, can you put in a 5G modem into a robot, and how does that simplify the setup of a production cell in a factory, and what will that mean? When you work with Volvo and look into, can we put the 5G connectivity into a Volvo truck, and how will that then simplify a self-driving truck in a mine or similar, right? So there's a lot of that also innovation with other partners, just to make sure that there is an ecosystem of 5G that can actually support the industrial use cases.
Thank you, and I agree. Actually, funny about small cells, I found a report recently, which is one I wrote 20 years ago on one of the first small cell vendors, IP Access, which was based just outside Cambridge. And I remember going to see them in 2001, and they were talking about enterprises deploying 2G pico cells. So these things don't always take time, even if the UK is at the forefront. So interesting bit of history there. There's a really good question that I can see is coming from the audience from someone called Andrew Kelly. He's talking about what he describes as connectivity inertia of essentially lock into legacy technologies. Yeah, and he's giving an example of the UK smart meter rollout using 2G mobile. I'm really interested in this because this area of what's called path dependency, where you make a small decision at an early point in time and it ripples through to the future, having an outsized impact, either locking you in. It inhibits behavioural change. It's why we all use QWERTY keyboards, 200 years on, or railway gauges. How do we stop that or limit that in connectivity and wireless? I mean, is there anything we're doing now that's going to be locking people in for 20, 30 years? And Bjorn, from Ericsson's point of view, it's probably a good thing to lock people in for 20, 30 years to be a loyal customer. But from a government and policy point of view, you probably want to be able to have a little bit of flexibility to change things. What can we do to limit that lock-in factor?
If I start, and I mean, honestly, and I've had this dialogue not with Howard, but other CTOs in other. So I think as Ericsson, we are actually quite keen in driving a new technology, and we don't want lock-in. We rather want to promote the benefits of 4G or 5G, and you can do narrowband IoT or Cat-M instead of having GSM connected smart meters. So there is a lot of new technology out there that can be used in a much more effective way. So I think for us that's actually better that they that the BTs of the world buy new things rather than anything. But then we need to respect that there's a big investment for the operators in terms of putting these systems in, and it's not just the radio, it's IT support systems and everything around that. So I think we need to be bold enough to disrupt ourselves also. It's easy to sit and sort of protect your cash cow, and at times it's actually better to disrupt yourself and move on. So I think there's an element of that, but also curious to hear Howard, because I mean there's a financial journey from an operator perspective in terms of the investments.
Howard, I'm interested in your view, not just from BT's point of view, but for actually industrial customers who may have even longer investment horizons. So I've spoken to people in utilities and rail who have said, well, we'd quite like to deploy 5G for things, but we don't want to have our spectrum refarmed in 2040 for 8G or 7G or something like that. Yeah, how can you give us a 30-year horizon of what we're going to be able to do with our network?
And I think this is a sort of, it's not a new problem. I mean, and your QWERTY keyboard example is a great one. But, we still have first generation ADSL because the future generations never quite got the same reach from an exchange building. And so we're now waiting to push fiber out further. We still have customers using ISDN and Killstream and so there are cycles here. And yes, we're infrastructure builders for connectivity, and that is, it's particularly the UK, that is a slow process. We mentioned some of the reasons before: heights of mass, the ability to get to land. One person in the population can object, and it takes 2 years to get a cell site. So there's lots of reasons there. But I do think also, and to your point, Dean, there, actually what's often the hardest piece is, not the interface that the telco provides, it's the equipment on the other end of it and changing that. So, and the investment cycles in some of those industries, water, railways, if I don't catch the right period in the 5-year investment cycle for water, let's say, I've missed it, and they've got no money to go out and replace any equipment, and of course they all happen at different times across the industry. So I'm actually just talking more about the problem here. I'm not sure we actually have the solution for this.
I mean, is there a more role for policy and government here? I mean, clearly we've had things like the analog TV switch off, which is perhaps a good example of this, where you might need a bit of a heavy lifting from government to sort of draw a line under something. We've got the PSTN switch off, and that's going to impact people with alarm systems and a few others. Does it just need a bit of a heave from government to sort of say, well, it's going to happen?
And that certainly helps. And I do think government are. I talk to my DCMS colleagues about this regularly, and also with Ofcom, they are giving that heave. One of the challenges, though, is if it's 5 years away, customers tend to not think about it for the next couple of years, and then it comes as a surprise, and then it takes a long time to do it. So I think we do have to find a different model here somehow.
But I think like 3G, 3G, there are several operators across the world who start to have clear plans to sunset 3G. So you need to put that sort of pressure on yourself to start to do that sunset, because then you start to resolve those customer problems also. So I think that's a good example.
So we've got 2 minutes left. I'd just like to have maybe 30 seconds from each of you on what do we need to do in terms of policy and innovation in the coming years to sort of really drive UK prosperity and productivity through the lens of connectivity and whether it's wired or wireless. So if you have 30 seconds to solve the world's problems, Alfonso, if you want to have a bash at that.
Well, I'd say keeping the legal framework stability. This is very important for investors in general, on technology and infrastructure, etc. This is very important as a country. I think that betting for the universities and the creation of knowledge countrywide is something that the UK will, if the country knows how to do it well, could make a big difference in the new global scenario of competition. And I'd say, let's say, making the most of this dynamic society, also wanting to understand new technologies and being 5G and being small cells and using that powerful adoption by the society to lead the technology advantage in and evolution in Europe.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Howard, penultimate word.
And I mean, it's great that we've launched the wireless strategy policy work today, actually, and it's great to hear that from the minister. I mean, the one thing and there's a number of things here. We've got to ensure that the incentive for investment is strong. And a great example, I would say, 50 meg broadband in 2017 what was the price? It was £41. It's now £29. It's reduced by 70% over 5 years. A standard Netflix subscription has increased by 125%. So I think it is time to look at net neutrality again. Big topic, but I think that one would... you and I can have some debates offline on this, Dean. But that one I think we should also have a look at and talk about again.
Okay, right, yeah, that is a topic for another day, and I'll park that one, and I'll see how much you're prepared to use someone else's data center or cloud, but let's leave that. Bjorn, over to you.
No, but I would think, I mean, back to where I started, we need to secure that we can roll out networks faster and easier in the UK. So reviewing that sort of framework, and I think that's really, really welcome. And then the second one is working with enterprises and continue to have that positive investment climate so we can drive digitalization for the benefit of both financially, but also sustainability.
Great. Well, thank you all very much indeed. I'd like everyone to give a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Hopefully next time we do this, we can do it in person. But I'd like to thank you and also to Tech UK for inviting me to moderate this. Sophie, over to you.